Well, when I got to Vietnam, I literally expected to be welcomed with open arms by the people of Vietnam. I had in my head the black and white newsreels I had seen on the Walter Cronkite 20th Century show of the American troops rolling through villages in France and being showered with wine and flowers and kisses. And as we were driving down, a guy from the battalion I was assigned to picked me up in a Jeep at Da Nang, and we had to drive the 20 miles to where my battalion was located. And I really was disappointed that there weren't people standing along the road waving to me and, offering me flowers and things. I really expected to be greeted with open arms as a liberator, and it was as though I was invisible, as though I didn't exist. And that was a little perplexing. Moreover, they looked funny and they acted funny. I mean, just riding along in this Jeep the first day I got there. They lived in little straw huts, and they had animals in their backyards, and they weren't like us. They smelled bad. The whole country smelled bad. It could smell it. It would. It hurt the nose, and that was disturbing. And then I was there on the third day I was there, this guy who had picked me up in the Jeep, a corporal, who I was ultimately going to replace. He and I were in the battalion intelligence section. We were sent down to the tractor park, the Amphibies tractor park, to meet a bunch of detainees. It was our responsibility to take care of prisoners, and detainees were a classification of civilians. They were not combatants. They could be detained for questioning. That's how they were, why they were called detainees. And Jimmy and I went down there to Track Park, and 2 tractors came in. They had a whole bunch of Vietnamese up on top. High, flat-topped vehicles about 8 or 9 feet tall, and as the tracks wheeled into the park, the Marines up on top immediately began hurling these people off. They were bound hand and foot so that they had no way of breaking their falls. And they were old men, women, children, no young men. And I couldn't believe these guys were treating these people this way. And I turned to Jimmy and I grabbed him by the arm and said, What are these guys doing? We're supposed to be helping these people. And Jimmy turned to me and he looked at my hands on his arm. I sort of took them off and he said, Ehrhardt, you better keep your mouth shut until you know what's going on around here. And I think it was at that point that I realized things were not quite what I was expecting. It went downhill from there, and again, I can't even begin to explain in the space of time that you have all of the things that went into it. But I began to understand. It became obvious that the enemy was the very people in these villages around us. We were in a very heavily populated area at that time. They were the enemy, or at least the enemy was out there somewhere, and we couldn't tell one from another. And day after day, our patrols went out and we ran into snipers and mines, and snipers and mines, and snipers and mines. I saw 4 armed enemy soldiers the first 8 months I was in Vietnam. And yet our battalion, during that same period of time, sustained 75 mining and sniping incidents per month, over half of them resulting in casualties. This is for a unit of about 1,000 men. But there was no one to fight back at, and you begin to think, these people are the enemy. They're all the enemy. And then you go through villages, and you get sniped at, and so you call an airstrike in on the village, and the whole village goes up. Or you go through a place, and you search it, and you burn houses and blow them up. The common perception, the notion I heard when I was in high school was the Viet Cong terrorized the Vietnamese population, forced them to fight against the Americans on the pain of death. What I began to understand in Vietnam was that they didn't need to do things like that. All they had to do was let a Marine patrol go through a village, and whatever was left at that village, they had all the recruits that they needed. I began to understand why the Vietnamese didn't greet me with open arms, why they in fact hated me. But of course, that didn't change the fact that my friends were getting killed and injured every day. And the only place that you could focus your own anger and fear was on those civilians who were there. And so, it was a self-perpetuating mechanism. The longer that we stayed in Vietnam, the more Viet Cong there were, because we created them, we produced them. None of that distilled itself into the clear kind of expression that I'm presenting now. What I began to understand within days, and which became patently clear within months, was that what was going on here was not as I had been told. What was going on here was nuts, and I wanted to get out. I knew if I were still alive on March the 5th, 1968, they'd stick me on an airplane in Da Nang. We used to call it the Freedom Bird, and I could fly away and forget the whole thing. Turned out not to be quite so easy to forget it. But that was the notion, and certainly for my last 8-9 months in Vietnam, I ceased to think. I quite literally ceased to think about why I was there or what I was doing. The sole purpose for my being in Vietnam at that point was to stay alive until I could get out. Then the reason for that is that, the kinds of questions that began to present themselves were just, the questions themselves were ugly, and I didn't want to know the answers. It's like banging on a door. You knock on a door, and the door opens slightly. And behind that door, it's dark, and there's loud noises coming, like there's wild animals in there or something. And you peer into the darkness, and you can't see what's there, but you can hear all these ugly stuff. You want to step into that room? No way. You just sort of back out quietly, pull the door shut behind you and walk away from it. And that's what was going on. The questions themselves were too ugly to even ask, let alone if I had to deal with the answers. Now, part of what was going on, as said, I could not have made sense of what I was seeing and doing in Vietnam because I did not have a full deck of cards. I needed to have an understanding of the political, historical realities that brought us to Vietnam before I could make sense of what I was seeing. I began to acquire the other cards in the deck during the 3 years or so after I got back from Vietnam. But while I was there, nothing made sense. Because I kept trying to, play this game with 27 cards instead of 52 cards. And it kept not coming out right, and I didn't know why. All I knew was that it was nuts, and it became clear within 3 or 4 months that my reasons for being in Vietnam were not clear. I mean, this notion of defending the people against these invaders from North Vietnam, the people hated me. The Vietnamese people hated me, and that was perfectly clear. I mean, the people didn't say good morning to you. People hated me. I know that some other people's experience was different, but in my own experience, the Vietnamese people hated me, and I gave them every reason to hate me. I beat them. I sometimes kill them. I destroy their houses. I destroy their crops. I destroy their fields. I destroy their culture. Why in the hell should those people like me? And I could see that I was doing that. And I could see that nothing we were doing was having any impact on the war itself. Now, the funny thing about Vietnam is that I was getting Time magazine every week. It came in the mail. I could read about my war even as I sat in the middle of it. And I would read about what Lyndon Johnson would say, and what McNamara would say, and what Russ would say. And I could look around and see that, aha, I don't know what war they're talking about, but that's not what's going on here. We actually had an incident happen where one of our line companies stumbled upon a fairly large cache of Viet Cong weapons and ammunition. and I read in the Stars and Stripes, the daily newspaper that we received. This little action actually made it into the papers, and we read that we had set the Viet Cong effort back by at least 4 months in our area. Within a week of that article appearing in the paper, within 10 days of the incident itself, the bridge 150 meters in front of our battalion compound was dropped by Viet Cong sappers. An Amtrak coming in from the Horseshoe area from one of the line companies hit a 50-pound box mine. Several men were killed. A bunch more were wounded. A patrol out of Phuc Track Grid was ambushed. Several people were killed. Several people were wounded. I mean, nobody told the Viet Cong that they'd been set back for 4 months, and yet this is what you were reading in the newspapers. This is what you were being told back in the United States. I could see that the war went on day after day after day, interminably at the same pace, no matter what we did. I'm wasting your film. When I left Vietnam, I was in the midst of the battle for Hue City during 10th, 1968, February 68. And I had been up in the city for 2.5, 3 weeks. And I knew that my day was coming, but I wasn't sure when. And at that point, we weren't thinking about things like that. And we were in the middle of a low-key firefight. We were exchanging fire with some guys across the street from us, along the northeast section of Hue City. What was left of my unit, the scouts, about 6 of us, and a jeep comes hauling up the street along the river and whips into this little compound where we were and says, "Ehrhardt, the orders are in, let's go." It's a lieutenant, my boss. And I stood. I didn't exactly stand up, but I immediately began to strip off my gear and distributed to the other guys who were there, and said, "So long, see you back in the world." Got on the jeep. The last thing I saw of those guys, they were laying down, covering fire for us. We burned our way back down the street. There was a chopper sitting on the LZ. I got on the bird. I was up 3,000 feet above Hue City. 10 minutes after, I knew I was on my way out and went through some processing. They yanked me out early because one of my older brothers by this time had arrived in Vietnam, and they arranged for me to spend a couple of days with him. And when I got back in early March, came in at night, went through more processing, place called Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay, and then I was free to go. And I still had time at the Marines. I had a month's leave, basically, before I had to report to another duty station in North Carolina. And I got a taxi, and there I was, my first view of the United States. And I could hardly wait. And it was absolute impenetrable fog. We came across the Oakland Bay Bridge, couldn't see 10 feet, couldn't see anything. Got to the airport, there was part of what affected my coming back. I was happy to be alive. I was excited, but at the same time I was very ambivalent. I was afraid, partly because I had a girlfriend when I went over there. And in September, 8 months after I was there, I got a Dear John letter from her. And I kept hoping that I'd be able to fix this up once I got back, and I did not know what kind. And that woman, that girl, had become the focus of my life while I was in Vietnam. She had ceased to be a real person. She'd become this icon. And then, of course, she had she'd take a hike. But you can't just let go off of a vision like that, of the thing that has kept you going. So, I was scared about all that. I didn't know what I was going to find when I got back. Finally got back to the East Coast.